My name is Paul Zolitsky, and on behalf of the writers and translators and editors of PEN, I want to welcome you to Stories That Travel, this panel discussion organized for this 11th annual World Voices Festival of International Literature by PEN American Center's Children and Young Adult Committee, of which I am co-chair. We'd like to thank the festival sponsors and supporters, as well as the many volunteers without whose contribution of time and lucre this festival could not happen. If you've attended any of the other events of the festival yet, you know that the festival this year, rather than focusing on a theme, is pointing at a specific region of the world, and in this case, its focus is Africa. And you can please check out all the full listings at penworldvoices.org. Next year's festival, by the way, will feature contemporary Mexican literature. So this festival is quite a massive thing, and this year, this is the only event featuring literature for children. The committee that organized it is one of PEN's most active membership committees. The Children's and Young Adult Committee, CYAC, which I propose calling KYAC, we have members all around the country. We meet monthly at the PEN offices in New York. There are about 300 writers on the list. And if you're a published writer for children, we encourage you to join us. The committee's activities include tracking and responding to episodes of censored or challenged books, which is a trend that's disturbingly on the increase. Administering the Phyllis Reynolds Naylor Award for Young Adult Book Length Work in Progress, contributing to the PEN blog, and sending visiting authors to the Martin Luther King Jr. Charter School in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. Shortly after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, this school was shipped the entire contents of the school library that was closing in the West Village, thanks to the initiative and efforts of our other co-chair, who will moderate this panel and whom I'd like to introduce to you. But first, I want to point out that after the event, books will be available right there for sale at the table, and the authors will be able to sign copies. And second, I want to remind you, please, to pull out of your pockets or bags every device you're carrying that rings or buzzes or makes any kind of noise, and make sure it's turned off for the duration. And third, Fatima Shaik. Fatima is a native of New Orleans, an expert in Afro-Creole experience. She is a assistant professor at St. Peter's University, and she has 2 collections of short fiction coming out this year: What Went Missing and What Got Found for adults, and Louisiana Stories for Young Adults for young adults. Ladies and gentlemen, Fatima Shaik.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen and friends. I'm here to talk about stories that traveled, and we came up with the idea for this panel because we were thinking about the way stories and ideas travel around the world, right? And they come to us, we carry them with us, we take them everywhere we go. I remember when I was little, and I grew up in Louisiana, and my mother used to talk to me about lapin et les chiens, right, the little rabbit and the dogs. And then after a while, I found out that this had been written into a book by Alcée Forché as Père Compère Lapin. And after that, I found out it was turned into Brer Rabbit, right, by Joel Chandler Harris. And we know that among the stories of Brer Rabbit is the story of the tar baby, which came from West Africa. And when I was reading through the stories, the books that we had, I saw that Baba Wagué had written this, illustrated the story of tar baby. So it comes all around to us. Sometimes we don't even know where they come from, but we know that we get them and we carry them with us. So we're going to talk about the way that stories came to these writers, our individual writers, the way that they interpret them for other people, why they carry them, and some of the challenges of bringing stories that may not have necessarily started in the United States to American audiences. If there are challenges, maybe there aren't any challenges. Right? So we'll talk about that a little bit. So I'd like to introduce our panel, our distinguished and fun panel. We're going to talk first to Baba Wagué Diakité, who was born in Bamako, Mali, and he spent his early childhood with his grandmother in the village of Kasero. At night, he and his cousins would gather around the family fire waiting for his grandmother to share stories, kind of like our families over here. Yeah. These stories connected them to the surrounding nature, to their ancestors, and to the history of their little village. Diakité arrived in the United States in 1985. He founded the Fallon Cultural Center in Bamako in 2004, and he returns to Mali annually to work with them and to direct programs. He's a creator of several children's books, including the award-winning The Hunterman and the Crocodile. So I would like to give him applause. Second person in the line here in our choir is Marilyn Nelson, whose latest collection is Faster Than Light, New and Selected Poems that came out in 2012, and How I Discovered Poetry. She's a professor emerita of English at the University of Connecticut, and she held office of the Poet Laureate for the state of Connecticut from 2001 to 2006. In 2012, she was awarded the Robert Frost Medal for Distinguished Lifetime Achievement in Poetry. In 2013, she was elected a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and the current Poet in Residence of the American Poets Corner at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. She is writing about several famous nuns, and we have to hear about that. Nnedi Okorafor, right next to me here. Her novels include Who Fears Death, which was a winner of the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel, Akata Witch, an Amazon Best Book of the Year, Zara, the Windseeker, which is the winner of the Wole Soyinka Prize for Literature in Africa, The Shadow Speaker, which was the winner of the Carl Brandon Farrellix Award. Her latest releases include the short story collection Kabu Kabu, and the science fiction novel Lagoon. Her adult novel, The Book of Phoenix, was released yesterday, so we have to give her and her young adult novel, Akata Witch 2 Breaking Cola, is scheduled for release in 2016. Nnedi is Associate Professor at the University of Buffalo in New York. So let's welcome Nnedi. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think we have such a great mix of people, you know, a storyteller and a poet and a fantasy writer. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. So one of the things, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask an initial question to each of our writers, the same question, and then I'm going to go through and ask individual questions to people. And we'll do this until we have about 20, 25 minutes left, and then I'd like to hear questions from the audience. So if you guys will help me with the time. You know, y'all know I can talk. I can keep talking. So what I would like to ask everyone at first, and can I just come down the line like that? So, you know, we'll do a wave. I'd like to ask everybody, what inspired you to write? And not just what inspired you to write, but do you think that your inspirations had anything to do with culture or ethnicity or nationality? Baba Wagué.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very pleased. And as she noted, I'm from Mali, and I grew up in a very small town. And it was during the time I was growing up in the 60s, it was little parents or grandparent, I would say, age were a little confused about whether they should send their children to Western school after 150 years of struggle. And, you know, so this was a problem, whether these kids would be actually acting more like colonialists after Western education, or they would turn around and see their cultural heritage. And for that reason, my grandmother, who had 14 children, and really they didn't have the chance to raise their children, they were all working for colonial railroad, plantation, and so forth. So after the children, the survival one that had children, so my grandparents really want those grandchildren to come back to the village to learn about their history and their people. And this is how I made it in the village with so many, I was 4 years old at that time, but with so many cousins. My grandparents, their way of connecting us to our past was through storytelling. Yes, my greatest inspiration was within the 14 years that I spent with my grandparents in the village and what we did, including storytelling. So And of course, the whole scene of African village scene is a story itself, much less for having a specific family that continue on this tradition. And we were farmers, and our survival depend on staying together as a community and working together. But there's a lot more you learn from that, than just simple storytelling, And I couldn't be raised any better than that, with many loving people around me that I see their life in my mind all the time. And a lot of people think that storytelling is one of those greatest thing that capture, but the people that actually tell those stories, my family down the street, my neighbors, those are the things that the people that captured me and are still staying with me as I am over 50 right now. So this is really where my inspiration source come. And after that, I went to Western school in the big city in Bamako. Of course, that was great, but I still just never forgot my way back to where my grandparents lived. And I found it, the education level of it was tremendous. It was a different type of education, but it was more connected to human folly, how we should live together and how we should treat nature around us. So I figured that this is something that, like my grandmother would always say, you have to pass it on. If you don't pass on a gift, that then you're ungrateful. And this is really what got me into storytelling and appreciating stories, until I came to the United States and find out that, wow, I've really gone far from the village. And my way to connect was to stay writing, keep writing about my life and my parents, my memories and so forth. And then my children came along in the 1990s, and then that was the beginning of it all, to start helping them to see this valuable cultural side of mine. And so it worked. It was great. Both of them grew up and they're writers too. So.
And I'm going to ask you about that a little bit later. I want to find out a little bit more about the influences. Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit, Marilyn?
Yes, very different background. I come from a family which has, for at least 3 generations, been very proud of African American history. And to start on one side, my mother's side of the family, several of my grandmother's sisters tried to write family histories because they had the feeling that their family was making history. So I grew up with a sense of living in historical time and being able to make a mark on history. My mother was born and raised in Boley, Oklahoma, which was one of the few all-black towns in the country. So she had grown up with a sense not only of history making, but also a sense of the ongoingness of folklore. So when I was in high school and discovered collections of African American folklore in the library, I found a lot of stories that my mother always told as if they'd happened in Boley. They were in a book. This was Mr. So-and-so in Boley. So that's one side of my family, and the other side is my father, who wasn't, I didn't know very much about his family. He was an only child, and his parents both died when he was in his 20s. So he never talked about his family. But he was a part of the group now known as Tuskegee Airmen. So there was this larger, almost family of military men who also had the sense that they were making history. So a large part of what I have done has been continuing the interest in history and in historical narrative. And I guess the only other component is my own personal one, which is that I was a very bookish child, and I discovered poetry very early and became committed to being a poet. So I was telling a group, I was in a high school this morning, and I told the students about an experience I had about 4 years ago in a middle school. And one of the 7th graders raised her hand and said, "Ms. Nelson, as a lyric historian, do you blah, blah, blah?" And I stopped her and said, where did that come from? Lyric historian, did your teacher say that? She said, "I just opened my mouth and it came out." And so I told her then that that's how I'm going to identify myself.
Yeah, my story is a little different too. Well, first, I had no idea that I would be doing what I'm doing now. I thought I was going to study insects. I wanted to become an entomologist, and that was up to my freshman year in college. So before that, I'd never written anything creatively, no, nothing. The only thing that I did was I loved reading. I loved reading everything. And so, but once I started writing, it was a creative writing class that I took in college that was where I discovered that, one, I loved telling stories, and two, I was good at it. So from the very beginning though, and both of my parents are from Nigeria. They were born and raised in Nigeria. They came to this country in 1969 for school and had to stay here because of the Biafran Civil War broke out, and they couldn't go back for a while. So, but as soon as that, so that was why my siblings and I were born in this country. But as soon as the war was over, my family reconnected with family in Nigeria. And soon after that, around the age of, for me, when I was 6, they started taking us back to Nigeria to reconnect with family, to get to know our heritage, all of that. And so these trips were insane, but wonderfully insane, but sometimes horrifyingly insane. And so the worst things in my life have happened in Nigeria, and the most wonderful things in my life have happened in Nigeria. So when I started writing and I sat down to write, it was just kind of this natural thing where from the very first story that I wrote, it took place in Nigeria. It was a little bit of nonfiction that happened over there. And also from the very first story that I wrote, I was weaving in just cultural things that had happened in Nigeria, because I was kind of drawing off of my own experiences, which are, you know, they're very, you know, being Nigerian and being there, I'm taking in a lot of things. So those things naturally came up in my work. And so that's where the cultural aspect kind of naturally came in there. And so as I continued writing, I wouldn't think about writing whether I was writing for adults or young adults. I just write the stories. But at some point, there was one trip that we took where I don't know how old I was. I must have been in my 20s. And the older I got, the more observant I was. So the more I would kind of understand what was going on around me, and the more I would kind of take in the cultural things that were happening. And so there was one trip around my 20s where I was observing my cousins, my younger female cousins, and my younger male cousins. And I noticed that the girls, or the boys had a lot of time. They could play video games, they could study, they had lots of time to just kind of stretch out and do what they wanted to do. The girls, though, when they would study, they'd finish studying, but they wouldn't have that time to play video games. They'd have chores, lots and lots of chores. They'd wash dishes, they'd cook, they'd clean, all these things. And I noticed that, and I was a little miffed by that. And so when I came home, that was still, and these are things that I noticed that I didn't consciously think, oh, I'm gonna write about this. It was just, I just took it in and kind of shelved it in the back of my head. And so when I sat down to write, the first young adult book that I had published came out of these observations with these girls, Zara the Windseeker. I wanted to write a story that, one, was a fantasy story that was set in a place that was like Nigeria, that was rooted in Nigerian folklore and mythology and culture, but also would be so intoxicating and the kind of story that would make girls like my cousins want to drop all of their chores and hide in a corner and read. I wanted to do that because I wanted to just disrupt that whole practice. So that was how the first book came out. Now, in terms of the science fictional aspects, because I write kind of a blend and a mix of whatever, I don't like categories, but the science fictional elements came out through cultural experiences as well. And the example that I always like to give, I didn't read a lot of science fiction growing up. I read some fantasy, but growing up, I never read anything where I saw a representation of myself. So that was one of the things that kind of led me to write young adult literature as well. But the science fictional aspects, it wasn't from reading science fiction where I was like, okay, I want to do something like this. My basis, my foundation was from whenever we would go to Nigeria, I would see things, I would see an interaction with technology and futuristic things that were unique from anything that I saw in Western flavored science fiction. And the example I always like to give is when I was in the villages, there's no running water in a lot of the houses, and the girls would have to go to the stream every morning and collect this water, and they carry it on their heads in these big containers. And so this is a very traditional image, right? And so, but what I saw was these girls going to the stream, carrying the water on their heads, but also they'd be holding the cell phone away, texting their friends. So it's like an interaction with the ancient and the modern. And so that, and there are many different instances like that I saw while in Nigeria. And those things kind of made me start thinking of, I don't see this in science fiction. I don't see this portrayal of present day Africa and a future Africa at all in science fiction. So that's kind of what led me to start exploring the science fictional aspects.
Well, she answered my second question already. No, it's okay, because I was going to ask you, because her work is speedy and rich like that with the old and the new. The young woman that gets in the taxi cab and the taxi cab sort of morphs into something that takes her into Nigeria, and all of a sudden she's a Chicago lawyer, and then she goes into this hot human place. She gets out the cab in this human place. So I was gonna, but I had a question. If you don't mind, I'm gonna ask her now. Go back down it. How do you start that though? Do you start with your character? Do you start with a plot? Do you plot it out? Like what is that would take you, because you've got so many influences in a story like that? Mm-hmm. Where do you start it?
Usually my stories start with the character. Mm-hmm. There's this voice in this person. Sometimes it's not a person. Sometimes it's a fish. Yeah. But
sometimes things with eyes.
Yeah, there's something. There's an entity that I start with. That draws me to the story, because for me, you can have the same plot, but a plot will shift depending on who is experiencing that plot. Like if you have a cliff where let's say the plot is the character jumps off the cliff. Depending on the character, like one character will jump off it happily. One character will be like, no, no, no. One will fly. So, it really depends. So my stories usually start off with the character, and then everything else just kind of, it's a very organic process. Okay. Very organic. So I can't really predict what it's going to be, right. But I think because being Nigerian American, those things just naturally just come into my work.
Thank you. So you're not saying, well, by this point in the story, I'm going to make it rise. The action is going to rise.
Yeah.
And it's going to turn. No,
well, that's usually in the editing. Okay. The initial part is just a mess.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask Baba Wagué, because he was talking about this, and you too, Marilyn. What do you think? Because both of you talked about how your families brought these stories to you. You had this very rich sense of history in your own family. What is it about stories that holds us together, do you think? What holds people together with stories?
What holds us
Yeah,
together?
why would a story hold a family together?
Well, stories are, here the thing about folk tales,
Yep.
specifically. Folk tales in where I come from are actually not made up stories as people think. And they are events that happen in the community. And what makes storytelling itself very interesting, not only we are telling stories of events that happen in the community, but it's also a glue to the community itself. So it's very important that people often come, in Africa, in where I come from, we don't have the same structure as in the West. You talk to someone there about counselor, they'll think that you're crazy. So community is the foundation of everything. So in community gathering, without storytelling, without proverbs and metaphors, I think it would be an empty spot. So yeah, the whole idea of stories and it's basically to actually retain, to remain people, to bring people together in harmony and open their eyes and their minds also to what is happening in their communities. So if my grandmother is telling a story, this story may be wild animals, but in reality, it's about the very same people of the community. So children grow up in Africa at a very early age, understanding how to actually, how to listen to a rabbit story, and knowing that it's based on true human experience. So those are the foundation that actually tie people together. I was totally shocked when I first came here that these folk tales, not only they're not written by someone who is actually from those native countries, but they're written by a visitor of 30 days or 2 weeks. And it's missing all the important messages and the way, and it's been turned into an entertainment thing rather than the seriousness that it's originated from. It's that there's no originality. So stories are actually even beyond all that. I've been in the United States in and out for the last 30 years, and I think I have never seen anything that brings people together in harmony and peace as storytelling is seen. So.
When you say that about the stories, what you're essentially saying to me is that the stories have been decontextualized, right? They've been taken out of the context that they existed, with the purpose that they existed, and turned into something else. But do they exist? I'm going to ask Marilyn Nelson a little bit. Do stories in African American communities exist within the context of some of the things that came from Africa? Do you think that some of the stories that you heard came from Africa originally?
I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't say. I imagine some of them did. Well, certainly the stories. You said you grew up with the rabbit.
With the little brown rabbit and the big white dogs. Now, it's a little metaphorical, sorry. But I grew up in segregation, so that was what they were telling us. Yeah.
So those stories clearly are rooted in cultural memory. When I was in graduate school, I had let's see if I can figure out a way to tell the story briefly. I had a fellowship for which all of the fellows were brought together twice a year to hear speakers talk about education. And one semester, usually these were academics, academics in education. But one year, our speaker was an African-American sociologist who had done field work in the Georgia Sea Islands. And instead of giving us the lecture we were used to, he told us stories about things he had experienced in his fieldwork. And I remember after his hour-long presentation, we met in small groups to sort of unpack the presentation. And we were so angry at this. We were discussing, what did he do? He's wasting our time telling these stories. Then about maybe 6 months later, it took that long, it started to dawn on me that everything he told us was so much more valuable than any of the lectures we had heard. Every one of his stories was about teaching and learning, and they were stories that came from the people, and I have to tell one of them because it's a story after I got it. I told the story on the first day of every class I taught for 30 years. He said that he was walking out one weekday morning, and a couple of men, he was just out on the street, a couple of men asked him if he would like to go dolphin fishing with them. And he thought, dolphin fishing, I don't feel comfortable fishing for dolphins, but it's part of my field work. I'm here, I'm a serious scholar, so yes, he went with them. And there were 3 of them who went in a rowboat. And in the rowboat, they had oars, a baseball bat, and a net. And they rowed out into the sea off the island. And then at a silent signal, the rower shipped the oars, and another man picked up the baseball bat and started beating on the bottom of the boat. And then they looked at each other and shrugged. And he put the bat down, and the other one picked the oars up and rowed out a little bit further. And they did this 6 or 7 times. And the last time, beating the bottom of the boat, dolphins started swimming toward the boat, leaping in and out of the water to get to the boat. And since dolphins eat fish, the fish were scrambling to get away from the dolphins, and when they came close enough, they just picked up the net and scooped the fish up. And I've told this story to all of my classes because it seems to me to be a model for a kind of teaching. Instead of presenting information, on the bottom of the boat. And that, I'm sure, was a tradition. Oh yeah, the other part of that is that I had a fellowship I was teaching in France, and I told this to my French students, and one of them had seen a documentary, a French documentary about Mauritania, I think it was, and this was a fishing technique there. So it seems to me that the technique is something that the people on the islands brought with them, and he passed this story on just as a storyteller, telling the story and teaching us something important about how a community works.
And it reminds me of what Wagué was telling us about not just community, but how everyone works together, right?
Yes.
And how they work with the environment.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Nnedi, I saw you taking a few notes. You want to tell us something about this?
I always, she's talking about that story that you told. I'm totally going to use that story.
I know what you were telling. I was thinking of you.
Yeah.
I was thinking of what you were telling.
Because, like, even with the moment of unsurety where you're like, okay, they're going out there with the bat, and you're thinking, okay, they're going to go out and bludgeon poor dolphins. And then it turns around, and they're actually working with the dolphins.
Right.
And I just creatively, I was just thinking of taking it even a bit further, where when the dolphins come, maybe some of the fish actually jump into the boat by accident. So, the brain is always working.
The fish was jumping in.
Yeah.
Well, and what I was thinking when she was saying that, I said, well, Nnedi could probably take that and bring all sorts of animals into that boat.
Yeah.
She's fantastic, right? I wanted to ask you a little bit about, so that then our identity is bound to our race. Is everything we write bound to race and culture? Is every sentence, every story bound to it then? Or do we write things outside of who we're growing up to be?
Well, when you are telling, remember, writing is an interesting thing. By many respects, even people who write fiction, even in fiction, there's some reality in it. So one of the things that I learned from my grandparent is that when something is passed on to you, it doesn't matter if it's physical human being, inspiration. All inspirations are passed on, are stuff that are considered to be passed on. Like any of us, all our knowledges are basically stuff that are passed on to us. So it only makes sense if you also take the same privilege and pass it on to other people. I think writing, in a sense, I see it that way, and I encourage my daughters are big readers, and I always tell them, you know, we live in a society where gift it's so expected, birthday, this, that, and so on. But when you're reading a book, as good as the book may be, you're actually taking something. So now what's your sense of giving back? So it doesn't matter if you're African or you're Chinese or you're green or yellow. Once you start bringing this thing into your mind and just splash it out there, it is for the whole world. It's not for a specific race. And I don't see my grandmothers thinking that, oh, you only have to tell the stories to the black people.
But because it comes through because it's filtered through your consciousness, the person that you are.
Yeah.
You can be reading something that is completely different from who you are, but it still filters through who you are at the moment.
Yeah, look at that story, that the root of it, where it comes from. And she's a nice filter of it, and then she absorbed it. And then somewhere we will see it.
It's lovely. Yeah, so I wanted to ask Marilyn, she wrote this book, about Venture Smith, The Freedom Business. The Freedom Business is a story, it was a slave narrative, and correct me if I'm wrong, it is a slave narrative of Venture Smith that Marilyn then, I thought of it sort of in a jazz way, sort of played off of his narrative into free verse. So, and there were parts of it that was so gorgeous of him. I remember a night looking up at the sky and being in love. And I was wondering, how did she wrap her head around making that difficult circumstance, that brutal circumstance, into something so beautiful? How did you do that?
That particular poem you're talking about, I lifted from a poem by Aimé Césaire, and I just changed the situation. But it's a riff not only on Venture Smith, but it's also on Césaire. And I've lost your question.
So I was just asking you, where did you enter slavery? At what point did you sort of think about the experience of slavery and find something beautiful? How did you do that? If you can, in 20 words or less.
Well, Venture Smith told his own story.
Yeah.
His story was one of the one or two first books published in Connecticut, published in, I think, 1795, something like that. So he told the story. And what I did was to try to enter into specific scenes he had already described. Most of his stories are about being either triumphing over people and making money, or about being cheated or tricked and having money taken away from him. But he insists several times in his narrative that he married for love, and that he and his wife were a love match. And so I wanted to be true to his experience of his own life. The first story he tells in his narrative, which you can find online, is a story of the time when the slavers came through his village, and his father was a prince, and they are all hiding from the slavers, and he helps his father bury the things that are valuable to the village. They bury them. And then he sees his father makes a deal with these slavers. These are African black slavers. He makes a deal with them. He gives them money that belongs to the village to save the people. They take the money and they take the people anyway. Mm-hmm. And then they kill him, Venture Smith's father. So the way he tells the story, it's so poignant because he believed in his father. And to see his father tricked in this way is such a disillusion for him that I had to enter that story too. So I tried not to invent anything, only to enlarge his experiences so that modern readers can enter into Venture Smith's. I don't know whether I'm making sense here.
That really made a lot of sense because it's a hard thing to do, to take something that is that poignant and that deeply felt. I remember the first time that I saw the names of people that I knew, family names on slave schedules. They had owned slaves in the 19th century, and these were families that I knew. I said, now, how do I process that? Where does that go,
If I can just
please.
say one more thing, that because I'm thinking now about Venture Smith, one of the stories he tells that I retell is about his saving money to buy his wife, and she's pregnant, and he wants to buy her before she shows, because this way he gets her two. It's a bonus child.
Yeah.
And the victory, he does it. The victory is so heartbreaking to have to think about purchasing not only the woman you love, but also your unborn child. And
it was a fabulous. I love the book. It was a wonderful book. Thank you. And the narrative, whenever you read slave narratives, you have that heartbreaking feeling, throughout the narrative, which you did just a beautiful way. As you said, bringing it to American audiences. So let me ask Nnedi, that are there things that when you're writing that you find that you have to turn the phrase or work at it in a certain way to bring it to an American audience? Because I think there are.
It's hard. It's a tough balance. I know when I'm in the initial process, when I'm writing something that's new, I won't filter at all. I won't I'll write it the way that it is in my head.
Right.
With everything in there. And then when I'm editing, I will look at things. I can't really recall anything that where I've been like, okay, American audiences won't understand this, I'm taking it out.
Right.
I usually find a way where I can show it or just turn it around a little bit just so that it's clearer. So but I also don't like to over-explain, and that's also one kind of creative decision that I've made where, for example, if there's a type of dish, a type of food, or something that that my character is eating, I'm not going to stop the story and say, this is what fufu is. It is a dough-like substance. I'm not going to do that because, for me as a writer, and as a reader as well, I will bore myself. So, usually, but I'll write that in such a way where the reader can see that food and kind of understand it in that way. So that can be very difficult. It can be, it's one of the things that when when an author is writing about a culture that they know is very different from their audience's culture, it's an additional burden where if you're writing about something that's familiar to your audience, you can just say it and keep on going. But when you're writing about a different type of culture, you have to, there's more skill involved. You have to really focus and describe and with just more skill, in order to not slow down the story, but have your audience understand what that thing is. And then there are also creative decisions that I have to make when it comes to language as well. In my novel Lagoon, and in Akatawitch too, and that's the first one. And the second one, I know I'm going to amp up the Pidgin English. I'm definitely going to amp that up. But in Lagoon, there are whole sections where the characters are speaking in Pidgin English, like deep Pidgin, Nigerian Pidgin English. And that was a decision that I actively made and I had them speaking that way, and I didn't change anything. I had a lot of help with the Pidgin English too from some experts, because I'm not that, I can understand it, but I can't speak it that well. And so when I wrote it, I kept it just like that, and then I gave it to my editor. And I was like, oh, let me just see what she has to say, and then we'll figure it out from there. And she came back to me and she was like, oh, I love this, keep it that way. And I was like, yes, thank God, because I wanted to keep it that way and let the readers figure it out. I figured that, especially if you're writing for an audience that reads science fiction and fantasy, they can figure it out. They'll figure out Klingon, they'll figure out Elvish, so they can figure it out. Exactly. So, I mean, this is an actual way of speaking that exists in our world, and so I think, and it's also English, so it's a little different, but I expect those audiences to be able to just relax and be willing and open. So yeah, but those are decisions that I've made.
Excuse me, is this an adult novel you're talking about?
Yeah, Lagoon is an adult novel. Akatawitch is young adult. So, and I also think that young readers are also open to that too. Mm-hmm. The code switching, I think they're very open to that. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you, just following that question, do you make a distinction between adult and young adult, and how?
Oh, I don't know. I think I will just write something. Like, I will just write it, and the main character will be a certain age. But also, there's a side of me that's very youthful. I will be grading papers inside and just looking outside at this nice sunny day and just imagining I want to just throw everything aside and go outside and chase the butterflies and the woodchucks. I love chasing woodchucks. Yeah. I find them very amusing. Very, very amusing. They're fat and slow. It's so funny. So I have a very youthful side, and I think that kind of naturally lends itself to writing young adult writing for young adults. I'm still very in touch with that side of myself. Also, I have a journalistic background. I have a master's degree in journalism, and I used to be a reporter for a few years. And because of that my writing style kind of takes from the journalistic writing style, so that it's very clear and precise and simple, and so that also naturally lends itself to writing for young adults. But a lot of times when I start a novel, I don't know what it's going to be until I write it.
Yeah. Well, I was going to just say that it's a total different challenge for me, because I speak English is like my fourth language, so therefore it's very challenging when I write. And in fact, I do most of my writing between French and my native language, Bambara and French, because I just don't have this courage to put it in English yet, because I think it depends on language, the structure of where I come from. We were talking about that today. I fear a lot of time of losing the importance of the story through the translation. And I feel like I am a better writer if I don't have to take the writing and present it to an editor to turn it into a book. Because I know that because through my nonprofit organization, I've been sending, data of writing about people and stuff. People love it that way. Even, my editor in Scholastic Press, they love it. But when it comes to writing children book or book to be published, that I know the story very well in Bambara, in French, but suddenly when I translate it in English and I read it over and over, I myself sometimes don't really like it. But, in the end, I do just like you do. I send it to, Scholastic Press, and the response back to me is totally unexpected. They just, oh, I love it. You need to keep it this way. Don't change, because your writing is a little longer, but it's English, but it's really not this English. It forces people to think and so forth. So I like to hear that. Those were a lot of encouragement. And indeed, I still write, and I love doing it. But also, my latest book, A Gift from Childhood, which is young adult, I was not writing for young adult. I was just writing, and this book was inspired because I don't think I went to all over in the United States, colleges, university, middle school. I'm visiting schools all over, but the young boys always keep asking me, "You gotta write about the boy, a little boy growing up in Africa." And finally, I just put some stuff together, and that became that. So.
Could you tell us just briefly about the foundation that you have with the
Yeah.
does?
Yeah.
You've got a room full of writers, I'm sure.
Yes, and I have a cultural center, a non-profit organization that's both in Bamako and Portland, Oregon, where I'm based, and it's called Kofale. Kofale means gift exchange. The reason I created that organization is that because when I was growing up as a young man in the big city, going to school and so forth, there was a lot of difficulties, and we were out of the classroom 1 month at a time. For my mother could not pay $5 for each one of us, and I just couldn't, really take the sadness in her face. And then she would look at us and they said, "Oh, the future looks so bright." And little did I know later on that future is us, the 5 of us she was raising. So she wanted to make sure we can help other families that are still in our situation in Africa. That's so funny, 60 years after independence, no progress. So this is the base of this organization, to support art, culture, and education. And we started it 20 years ago, and with 30 kids, now it's 1,700 kids. And Rana, my wife, is sitting there, and without her, I couldn't have done it.
Thank you for letting me Since we're talking about writers and what writers are interested in, what is a publication situation like in Africa, in Nigeria? Do they have many children's publishers? Do you publish there?
Yeah, I have two of my books were published there, Zara the Windseeker and then Akata Witch, by a different title. That's a whole other story. But
tell us.
Yeah. Well, the term Akata. Okay, Akata Witch is it's a fantasy novel set in present-day Nigeria about a girl who was born in the United States, and she moves from the United States when she's 9 with her family back to Nigeria. Her family's Nigerian, and the story starts when she's 12 years old, and she also happens to be albino as well. So she's got a whole bunch of cultural stuff going on, and on top of that, So she's doing her thing, and then on top of that, she finds out that she's part of this secret magical society called the Leopard People, the Ekpe people, which is based on an actual Nigerian secret society. And so once she gets involved with that, then adventures ensue, and there's lots. And the story is deeply based in juju, in Nigerian, specifically more Igbo and some Yoruba, but juju. That's African magic, amongst other things, and some fantastical stuff going on there too. So that's what Akata Witch is about. The title, okay, you can get where the witch comes from. That's the Akata part. Akata is a very strong word in the Nigerian community. It is a derogatory term for African Americans and foreigners. Yeah, it's a derogatory term, and so the main character gets called an Akata witch. I want to use the B word, but I just kept it with the W word. And so that's
It's young adult after all.
Yeah. Yeah, we couldn't put that in the title. So that's the title. So when it was published in Nigeria, they looked at the, and my editor is right here, Sharon. Yeah. But so when it was published in Nigeria, they had to change the title because the term Akata is very, very inflammatory. It's like, no, no, no. And then the word witch also is equally inflammatory for a different reason. And they felt that Nigerian parents would not buy the book for their kids with that title. So it's called What Sunny Saw in the Flames in Nigeria. And even with that title, what they found is the book has sold very well in Nigeria, and my publisher is Cassava Republic. The book has sold very well in Nigeria, but my publishers tell me that still it's because the kids are demanding it. The kids are demanding it. The parents don't want to buy it because they think it's about witchcraft, which it kind of is. But it's like, it's like witchcraft, Harry Potter. Harry Potter's about witchcraft too, but not that kind of witchcraft. So yeah, their parents are resisting, but the kids are demanding it. So yeah, there's several small publishers in Nigeria, and they have to be very aggressive. There's a whole politics with the publishing industry, but there is a small, there are a few prominent publishers in Nigeria.
Well, this is very interesting to us because PEN is an anti-censorship organization, as you know. So I don't think that only in Nigeria do parents not buy books because they don't like the content. I think they get a little censored over here too. And people challenge them, quite a bit.
Yeah, just a little.
Yeah, just a little, just a little. Let me see. And is there institutional support? I mean, not institutional. Is there governmental support of publishing, like the National Endowment? What about in Mali?
Yeah.
There's something similar to the National Endowment here? Is there?
No, there is very couple publishing companies that I know of, but they're not connected there to the government. They're independent. In fact, I've been. They've asked me a couple times. I'm still thinking of it. You have to realize that Mali is a French-speaking country, and so there's very, very little. They look at me sometimes as big because there's very little information from French-speaking countries to English-speaking countries. And you can sense that when you go to the library and look anything about Mali. I think that's one of the reasons why my stories are well received. But as well in Mali, because every year I do, or every other year, I travel through American International School to visit towns in Africa and visit schools and storytelling and so forth. My book is well known around West Africa. I haven't been in Nigeria with my books, but all the French-speaking countries, because part of the reason why I like to do that is to encourage them to actually be receptive with English language at this moment, which is being picked up in French-speaking countries quite a bit.
I think I'm going to have one last question to everybody, a little quick hard question, and then we'll open it up to everybody. If you could tell American writers. One thing about African literature or African American literature, what would it be as a writer?
Me first.
You first. How would you characterize, well, I guess that's really general. How would you characterize yourself? What could you tell them about African literature that we do not know?
Well, the first thing that popped into my head is that it's far more diverse than many people think. There are all kinds. There is, you know, the more traditional literary stuff. There's excellent memoir. There's excellent crime fiction. That's a big area that's starting to really bloom. There's excellent science fiction. Science fiction is fast coming up in African literature, and same for fantasy. All the genres, they're all coming up. So I think that what people need to know is that African literature is far more diverse, and it's not only about misery and poverty and disease and all those, which are important areas, but that's not all African literature is.
Thank you, ma'am. Would you like to make a statement about African American literature to cover the whole?
I mean, everything is changing so rapidly. When I was a girl interested in poetry, there was Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks. Now there are, I think, 5 living Pulitzer Prize winning African American poets. It's mind-boggling. But the one thing that seems to be characteristic of African American literature, which I have always believed probably we've inherited from African cultures, is the sense of praise singing. Not only, a lot of people of my generation and younger are interested in telling history, teaching our history, but I think we're also very much involved in holding up heroes and heroines and praising them. And I don't think that other American literatures value that interest as much.
Well, basically, I get to stick with what she said earlier on. There's a lot more to, indeed, Africa of what we know. And the African history, I would say to my African experience, there's no event in Africa that is not a story. That's what really connects me to this place. And you know, I remember growing up, my grandmother would say, you know, don't take life seriously. And people's parents say that to them here as well. But it is not with the same reality that the extension of, you know, even a very difficult moment can produce entertainment level. And that's what I like about Africa. And I feel that if you see Africa and its people the right way, there's never gonna be an end to stories to sing, you know, from them. So.
Beautiful, thank you, thank you. Our audience, do you have some questions? I'll give you a minute. I know you almost have questions. Yeah, somebody over here and here. And here. How about start?
Yeah, I have one thing I wanted to just point out,
Yes.
so that you can talk about it more. Talk about the difference between the Nigerian edition of your book and the American edition. That's in the language.
Yes, yeah, well, I kind of mentioned it. Okay, so the difference between the Nigerian and American edition of Akata Witch, the biggest difference was there was a lot more pidgin English. You know, there's a lot more where characters were speaking in deeper pidgin English, because the idea was that in the Nigerian edition, the readers would totally get it. They just completely understand it. It would not be a problem. And there were certain foods that were added to the Nigerian edition that I didn't have to describe. A lot of Nigerian dishes are really complex and like annoyingly complex. I cannot cook them, and they're really difficult to describe as well. But in the Nigerian edition, I just have it in there, and they get it. They get it. So yeah, that was
Somebody over here on the end?
My question is also for Nnedi. I was wondering, I was actually talking to some of my friends just the other day about science fiction and young adult sci-fi especially, and how the contemporary, like current books and films based on books that are coming out now, seems like everything is this dystopian world. And I was talking to my friends about how I kind of feel like a lot of this, especially young adult sci-fi, this sense of like the dystopian world view seems to be kind of like recentering white people as victims. And I'm wondering, as someone who has worked in, who's written books that deal with or incorporate sci-fi themes or speculative fiction themes, do you feel like the sort of the dystopias or something that you think about in your writing, or if so, how you incorporate that or how you respond to them?
It's interesting because three of my novels are dystopian. And one of them, okay, so Who Fears Death is set in a post-apocalyptic Sudan, way in the future. The Book of Phoenix, which just came out, is about the end of the world, basically. That's the whole point of it. And The Shadow Speaker, which is my second novel, is set in the country of Niger. And after, it's post-apocalyptic, and it's set in 2070, I believe. What's funny is, okay, so The Shadow Speaker was published in 2007, and it was sort of before this whole trend was happening. I've been obsessed with the end of the world for a long time, And I just find it interesting because personally, I'm fascinated by the idea of everything being destroyed and us having to start over, and what are we going to do? So that is fascinating to me. And also what's interesting is when I landed here today, as I was driving in, I'm seeing ads for Terminator, Mad Max, and some other images that were very dystopian. So yes, the whole idea of the dystopian world is very much in our conscious right now, in adult and young adults. That's something. But for me, I know when I wrote the Shadow Speaker, I was thinking of the idea of the apocalypse happening. What if it were a good thing? That was my what if. How can I make it so that it's a good thing? There's something pleasant about it. So in The Shadow Speaker, the end of the world happens when there's a nuclear holocaust that's caused, of course, by human beings. And then there was a Haitian mad scientist who created these things called peace bombs. And these peace bombs were to be launched at the same time as the nuclear bombs were launched. And so the peace bombs, where nuclear bombs destroyed everything, peace bombs would create things. So when he launched these peace bombs, it brought magic and all this strangeness back to the world, where you have spontaneous forests happening and like weird portals and just weirdness. And it's a far more pleasant post-apocalyptic world than you'd normally see. And it came from that question of like, what if there were butterflies instead of smoke and ash? So it's definitely a theme that I'm interested in, clearly. I mean, even in Akatowicz, there's the hint of, she sees something that hints at the end of the world, at nuclear holocaust, like a nuclear holocaust happening in the near future. She sees that. That is part of the novel Akatowicz, but the story itself isn't focused exactly on that. At least book 1 isn't. Book 2, maybe. But it's very much in my subconscious too. So I can't really divorce myself from that trend. But I've been thinking about that for years, for a long time, and it's something that I find very interesting. And I think there's a general fear and an apprehension in just the world. We see what we're doing to the earth. We see there are a lot of things that I think human beings are aware of that we're doing that are not going to come to a good end if we don't change what we're doing. So I think that's where those stories are coming from as well. I hope that answers your question.
Right here, and then there, yeah.
Mine's a general question to all three of you. I'd like to talk about the term African writer. So how do you feel about this? Do you this feel like a pleasure to be associated with a wider community, or do you feel this flattens the differences between countries?
Well, of course, we may be African writers, but we're writers. We're always very happy to be connected with the rest of the world. Remember, everything we do and have joys in really have to see with the rest of the world. And I hope we won't be destroyed soon before our next books come out. Yes. So anyway, yeah, indeed. On the serious note, yes, I think it's really beautiful to be included, to be part of a bigger audience, and I love it. So, what's your
African American.
I've been reading Americana
Yes.
by Chimamanda, and I've noticed that there have been several wonderful scenes in which the protagonist has conversations with white Americans, and they just toss out everything they've ever heard about Africa. Oh, you're from Nigeria? I traveled in Tanzania. Oh, well, I give money to Malawi. And they have this sense that it's all one. And actually, there was a children's book that was published maybe 1 or 2 years ago. The title is something like, I Lost My Teeth in Africa.
That's my daughter.
That's your daughter! So she said that the original title was specific, and that then she had to change it.
Really?
Yeah, but it was a specific country. Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. Is that?
I lost my tooth in Africa.
Yes.
So there was originally specifically an African country, Mali?
Mali.
And they changed
it.
How did you feel about that?
Well, I didn't even know, I didn't even read that in the book. My wife is here. Did you read it?
Well, I think they thought it would bring a more general interest in it, because very few people, when they hear Mali, they think you're talking about Bali in Indonesia. So, Mali is really not high on their radar. Africa is much more palatable for a Western audience.
See, and that speaks to that whole idea of Africa as a country when it's
Right.
not.
Yes.
It's very big,
Yes.
and it's very
Or do you speak
diverse.
African?
You can go a few miles down the road and they're speaking another dialect which sounds like another language, and it's just so full of so many different types of people and ways of doing things. And when I think about, I'm an African writer and I have no problem being called that. No problem whatsoever. I call myself Niger American. Niger is slang for Nigerian. So I like to run it together. And that's how I've always identified. And I have been in situations where African Americans have said I'm not African American because of my cultural background. I've been in situations where Nigerians have said I'm not Nigerian because of my cultural background. I've been in situations where I've been called the N-word in this country many times by whites. So, I've been in situations where other people are always trying to define me. I don't let other people define me. I define myself. So,
What is our time like? I think I had another one. 20 after. I had another question.
Yeah.
There it is.
Great. Well, I've known all of these writers through the Children's Africana Book Awards. Loving their books for many, many years. But Baba Wagué, you have not mentioned your illustrations. When you're talking about telling a story, I always imagined you painted the pictures first.
Ah.
And doesn't matter whether it's Bambara, French, English. Your pictures tell your story. So cute.
Yeah, well, I do my children's book illustration on ceramic. And traditionally, I am not from a family that are potter. You know, in Africa, everybody has their thing. So, you know, usually blacksmiths are potters. And sometimes I get laughed at when I went to Mali. I go to Mali, some people say, hey, well, you know what, you are supposed to be a Fulani, now why you're making pot? But it's really kind of interesting because there's also a story to support that, you know. That's why I always talk about the richness of you know, Africa and villages. What she was talking about, that's one clear example. Where I come from, in the same village, there's about 5-6 different languages, and it's a very small town. So we really get to learn how to, you know, adopt ourselves with our community with one thought. And so there was a blacksmith in the community that was just an inspiration, and he was a funny man, and his family, wives used to do pot, and that's how really the fascination about pottery came to me. And when my wife met me, I was teaching a small school, and finding out that she was an artist, and she looked at some of my drawings, which I'm teaching children how to illustrate stories, and she thought it was really interesting. So I invited her to come over and let's draw. And so she came, and
Romantic.
so we said, yes, that was the first romance. And then we all have paper and say, let's draw. And I guess she said, draw what? And I said, this is the way we do it here. So you just draw what's in your mind, who you are, what you feel. So.
Sure.
I have a question. Years ago, I read some books by Angel.
Yes.
My Life in the Bush of Ghosts and The Palm Wine Drinkers. And when I read Nnedi's book, The Wind and Winseeker, I immediately saw those books. Do you have, or do you feel any, and I don't know whether he was Nigerian or Ghana, I don't know what the background was, but there's a real similarity in his transformation of the characters from one reality to another, just like immediately. Is there a connection, or do you see that as part of a literary tradition in terms of African writing?
Yes. First, Amos Tutola is a Yoruba writer, and what I consider him one of Nigerian's first fantasy writers. You know, a lot of his stories were taken from Yoruba folktales, but he fleshed them out, and they're so weird and crazy, and I love them, and they're so bizarre. And there's so many shout outs to him in like 3 of my novels. But I think that, that whole idea, the storytelling and the blending of the mystical and the mundane are, at least for me, they are a way of thinking that comes from the Nigerian side of me, definitely. Especially when I'm talking to elders, and they'll just start talking about something, and then they'll have like somebody who could fly in what they're describing, and it's normal, and it's just part of everything, and so I grew up with that. And I kind of incorporated that into just not just the way that I tell stories, but just my philosophy and the way that I view the world. So
is it a part of a Yoruba tradition of oral literature, or is it something that, because he was writing in the 40s or whatever, became contemporary literature? So you're saying it's from the oral tradition?
I think English wasn't his first language, and that was the reason why it's written the way it is, but his editors kept it very much the way he wrote it. So the stories that he was telling he was taking from old tales, Yoruba folk tales, but he was adding his own kind of, I want to say it's a Western practice, you know, this idea of taking something fantastical and fleshing it out into a real story, but I wouldn't say it was, because I don't think he was influenced by the West. I think he kind of just pulled that from himself and then just added that to tell those folk tales in non-folk tale ways, because those stories are not written like folk tales. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Marilyn, because I wasn't familiar with the book that you wrote about the slave. Yeah, but I very much cherish Aretha Emmett Till, and which I think is just such an amazing sequence of poems and such a courageous piece of writing. Because as a writer, I think to go into a topic that's so upsetting and so disturbing just takes so much strength. And I thank you for doing that for us, because then we read it and we're able to experience what happened to Emmett Till through your eyes. And it's so powerful.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Well, I have another question, and maybe, and what time is it, my people? About 5 more minutes? Okay.
This question for Nnedi was, given how you were talking about television having different editions or adaptations for the Western market and the Nigerian market, I was thinking about the context of Salman Rushdie, and in particular, like her and the Seal story. And I'm from India, so the way he writes, there's just one edition, right? But if you have that context, it's kind of an inside joke that you get.
Yeah.
And otherwise you don't. So what do you think about that in terms of having 2 separate editions versus just having inside jokes together?
Yeah, I think,
Well, sort of repeat the question on the side. Would you like to summarize?
I summarize that.
Yeah, I'll repeat it.
Yeah.
She was saying that when you make 2 different editions, it seems as if that you're changing the language. When if you leave it in its original writing, it has more inside jokes that why can't just the people appreciate it? Some people appreciate it more than others.
Yeah, I like that book, Harun and the Sea of Stories. I loved it. That's wonderful. One of my favorite Rushdie books. But I like the idea of just having those things as inside jokes. And as I said, with Akatawich 2, I know I'm going to put in more of those things and work more of those things in. I'm going to have the Pidgin English in there. I'm going to have. I feel like as a writer, the more I write, the more I publish, the more experience I gain. And with Lagoon, and seeing the success of Lagoon, and seeing how well received, especially those Pidgin English parts were, that was a good lesson for me. I think that when I approach the Pidgin English sections in Akatawich, there might be a few things that I do it slightly differently because it's for a young adult audience. But with this one, I will have like just one version of it with those things in there that some people might get and some people might not. So yeah, I think that's what I've learned from the process. Yeah.
Do I have anybody else?
Marilyn, you mentioned earlier that, in terms of role models or writers who write the way that you've been interested in, it started with a few poets when you were a young girl, and now you have 5 living Pulitzer Prize winners. Do you find with the kind of writing that you do that now as more authors become more prominent for what they're doing, they are representing a wider spectrum of that literature, or is it still a sort of Western influenced, what's still palatable to the Western reader type of book? And so, and if you do, then all 3 of you, are you trying to find new ways to present the stories that aren't being told about Africa, about some sweep of geography that otherwise is being represented by these authors that exist today?
I think that's another question.
Well, I mean, in terms of what I'm doing, that's precisely what I'm doing. That's one of the reasons I started writing, was because there were stories that I felt needed to be told and that weren't being told. And one of the things that I also like to look at is I like to bring the point of view of the story very, very close and very, very local. So it's not just showing this sweeping, like, this is the whole country of whatever. I like to focus on, I like to focus on common people. I don't like writing about royalty. That's never been, I let other people do that. There are lots of other people who like to do that. But I like writing about common people, looking at just normal, interesting events up close. So yeah, that's something that I personally seek to do. But
I think just spinning off a little bit of what Nnedi said, I think that I read mostly poetry, and among the young African American poets, what I see that is new, unprecedented, I think, African American poetry has almost always been about the African American community. If the first person pronoun is used, it's intended to be I'm speaking for everybody. The Negro speaks of rivers. There's a whole tradition of seeing oneself as the representative. And I think this new generation is much more willing to write about their own personal experiences. And I think the amazing success of Jacqueline Woodson's new book, Brown Girl Dreaming, is a very good example of that. That here we're given a brown girl and her life and her family. We go into her home and we have a sense of her as individual person, not as representative speaker for the race.
I felt how poetry saved my life, and I've been more wider, just this explosion of long narrative poetry. You feel that's something that's new, and that it's the opposite of dystopian in how much is being written now. That is long narrative novel like what? Like years and memoirs.
What's his name? Kwame Alexander. Yes.
I just read one about the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Haikus for every American that was killed. One syllable.
Yeah. Really?
Oh,
I have to find out more about this.
Yes. I just asked if you notice that as you're teaching children who are more interested in poetry.
I see young people very interested in poetry. Most of the ones I see are more interested in writing their own poetry than in reading it. I feel is another issue, but a really serious issue. I think there's something we're failing at, frankly. But yes, the emergence of the novel in verse is a really interesting phenomenon. I can't explain it. I don't understand it, but I'm hoping to hold on to it because it's very much what I would like to do. You know, like telling narratives and at the same time holding on to the musicality of language.
As a reader, it's a great book.
Well, I think we have had a lot of joy tonight.